Dear John, in many ways this letter is about walking away from things, about making a clean break with the past, tradition, expectations. But it is also about starting over again, and in leaving, the sense of delay between departure and arrival, that brief interval of time in which everything is new, before hearkening back to the familiar road signs of past lives. These, then, are just some personal reflections on the topic of rebirth. I'd heard through the grapevine that you'd moved out of the loft space, lost your fan base, and burned some books. In situations such as these, where paths of destiny diverge, pulling decisions on down the line, what is one to do but suspend all judgment, to stare into the black void of time, to search there for some perspective, to reassure ourselves that we are moving forward through the darkness. Here's how I heard about everything that happened. Returning back home to Chicago, I found myself in a pickle, just a bunch of things pulling me in a slew of directions all at once. I stayed for a night in the loft space above Lubinsky Furniture, eating Texas barbecue with Chris as he told me all you'd been through since we last saw each other. To make a list of all the things that he'd told me, to perform the actions of due diligence, to make sure that this was even real, would be impossible. I haven't immediately Googled all of this. As I heard it, I merely sat there and tried to understand how a lot of this made sense. I don't want to make it sound like I had always taken you for a book burner, but in a strange way, this story was something that had been hanging all around me, that had been in the air that whole summer, and what happened to you was simply the last piece of a puzzle, providing a scaffolding to pin it all on, to prove that whatever that was hanging was more than just trending. So often words out of context have little meaning, or worse, face misinterpretation. I took pictures of Chris tearing into guiltless flesh, recounting stories in which you had been burning books and videoing yourself burning books. Watching him eat, I remembered Burroughs entitling his collection of junkie notes, Naked Lunch, a frozen moment in time when everyone sees what is on the end of every fork. Burroughs had been sent upriver too. His friends testified in favor of his good character. You need somebody to do that for you here. In justifying Burroughs' work, there was a moment of misconception, of others just not getting it at all. So there must have been some hesitancy on his friends' parts, the duality in the transition between departing for a destination and the arrival. The question of censorship and the value of predecided social mores. He must have, as we must now, realize that we're running with scissors. The judge, of sound mind and body, decided to suspend all judgments until he had enough to go on. He needed evidence and context to reach a decision. In a way, that's the purpose of this letter. I want to provide that context, and I want to try to understand why these things happened to you, by you, etc. Hopefully it doesn't end up spinning off into obscurity, but I can't shortchange the muse. All right, as one judge said to another,
be just.
Be just.
If you can't be just, be arbitrary.
One of the greatest joys, believe it or not, of coming back to America from a long journey in a country which does not have it, is listening to American radio again. The chatter, the regular programming associations, the commercialization of the airwaves. One of the things that was already on my mind that summer was something that happened to me while listening to the radio. And I had heard an old Eric Clapton song entitled Motherless Child, and the lyrics, "If I mistreat you, girl, I sure don't mean no harm."
Sure don't mean no harm. If I mistreat you, girl, sure don't mean no harm.
What was strange about my listening to it this time was that I realized previously, every time I had been mishearing that line, "I sure don't mean no harm." The thing is, I'd been hearing it, "show me no harm," as I think Philip Seymour Hoffman had seemed to sing it in the movie Twister, which must have been one of the first times I'd heard the song as a kid. The correct lyric is one of unintentional harm. while the one I'd been hearing and singing was quite a bit more insidious. I'd loved that movie, and I'd loved Hoffman's character Dusty the most. Epiphany of my finally hearing the song correctly was ever more poignant as the details of the actor's death flooded the daily news rotation. In any event, it was something more than just another celebrity meeting an end of excess. Hoffman's death produced an intense feeling of unease in the psyche of the American public, as if his life were imitating his art in a meta-narrative bid to forever shatter the tabloids and reality television's hyper-real suspension of disbelief. What was disconcerting about the Philip Seymour Hoffman death was with what sense of synchronicity the stories told by CNN and MSNBC, even the BBC, mimicked the lives of the fictional characters he had portrayed. A lovable loser, a widower in mourning, a wounded messiah, an egotistical alcoholic in love with his own voice, a desperate loner, a closeted homosexual, an unsuccessful sexual predator, a malfunctioning playwright whose art, as a faithful imitation of life, becomes more and less real simultaneously. The victim, and they use that word, the victim of an apparent drug overdose. He had so often played the victim of circumstance, and now the report foisted the role back upon him in much the same way. It was only left to our imaginations to fill in the blanks between the real character's lines. Truly more than any other, Hoffman's portrayals chronicled those falling through the cracks of society, losing himself in the loser and showing us a stinking handful of what our society does not find value in. Most of the drama was unseen, aftermath images of small envelopes marked with the ace of hearts, as if the user were trying to compartmentalize addiction to stave off some hideous yearning. This easily could have been adopted as a role for Hoffman. It was his real life. That these images are not a stage immediately threatens our suspension of disbelief. Hoffman was apparently not acting as much as he was enacting, or perhaps the roles overtook him. We have a limited timeline to check for facts. He was found in the bathroom, a syringe apparently still in his arm, almost as if in the throes of a final performance. Regardless of the reality of the situation, the one thing that any artist cannot protect against once a work of art is released is its interpretation on the receiving end. One may be indelibly faithful to one's own artistic vision, only to find the communication lost upon reception. Taking a cue from T.S. Eliot, whose insight you expressly shared in at least one of your own comics, every new work must find its place within a tradition of art that has already been interpreted and consumed. I'm Googling now. So, no wonder one may find oneself reading reviews of one's own work only to come away unsatisfied. Your fans' fundamental misunderstanding of your Kickstarter messages reflect their insistence upon reinterpreting your words to fit their conception of the personality artist. What you need to tell them is, that is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. Well then, what? Regret is a powerful tool for the personality artist. These traditions, interpretations, expressions, and methods of consumption seem anything but universal. A singular image which seems to have become fixed in the dictionary of cliches as enraptured bliss yet which begs for an individual's interpolation, is expressed here in a lovingly simplistic display of, what shall I call this? Beauty? Enrapture? Ecstasy? I call it an image of horror, pure and simple. In response to this image, and to your image, I have scoured the internet for similar interpretations. In each of these images, we are left to rely upon our own hideous inner strength to stave off revulsion. The image that seemed meant for me alone that summer, which came from the silver screen rather than television, was one of the utmost horror disguised as rapture, as an AIDS-afflicted Matthew McConaughey becomes engulfed in butterflies. It seems we are being asked to view this scenario as a life-giving force, majestic beings raining their fairy dust onto a tortured soul come rising phoenix. As for me, you might have guessed it, I find a great deal of anxiety even in the thought of being covered in insects of any kind. Even while plucking a single ant from a forearm, I have been plunged into that microscopic world that focuses upon reticulating hairs on every surface and pollen dust clogging every pore. The only transformation of power I can stir is to inverse the butterfly's costume to that of an old English magistrate's cape of white and black speckles, bringing me full back round again to the conflicted image of a hairy monarch's legs and curling tongue. But this butterfly effect is all too common, and I don't suspect everyone has the same reaction as I do to this. Sometimes I feel empathetic, and if that is a word, then I have used it. It's very rare in our society to be asked to think of others from a viewpoint completely outside of our own. We are instead asked to rely on categorical imperatives, and this seems important. I've dwelled on this more than once, because it gives us an ipso facto reason why not to do the things that we don't want done. For instance, don't burn books simply because you don't like their authors. If everyone did this, there would be no books left. For instance, Meryl Streep was caught some years back, and she's paid a lot of money to suppress the photos, of burning a collection of Balzac, because she cannot stand Balzac. I find him merely tolerable, but it goes to show that each of us is really a global village of one. Now every time I sit down to read Illusion Perdue or La Peau de Chagrin, all I can think of is Meryl Streep, and I can only ask myself, what in this does she find so burnable? So are we now ready to take a look at the happenings of said pictures? We have a veritable compendium of references to the artist, to art, to life, to analysis and interpretation, but to be fair, let us repaginate the paper tiger, freely associating these elements back into consensus with one another. Life sometimes imitates art, it is true, and interpretation is personal, but these truths hint at an existence and subsequent encounter with the other. In the end, I am writing to you from a faraway land, telling you, informing you, insisting upon my own outlook to the situation you now find yourself thrust into by a fan base which seemingly turned against art for art's sake. I will briefly try to summarize this all to you, which in my opinion will not work. Here we have ground zero images of the fascist at home. What does he do in his spare time? Why, he burns books, of course. To support his work is to support militant fascism, an iron-fisted grip on the will to power. The book delivered to the cleansing flame by the hand of a brainwashed compatriot. Here we see the horrid effects of a nervous breakdown, a fit of desperation brought on by a basic chemical imbalance. To support his work is to support a loose cannon whose output is ultimately unpredictable, alternately bad and good, and often at the same time. The book brought before the sacrosanct altar by a devout apprentice. Here is the artistic act of vandalism, a burst of destructive creativity, a man studying the effects of leveling his world to build again. To support his work is to support the enfant terrible of art, the stinging spur in the side of society. The book, the object of mad frustration, cast into the consuming oblivion of destruction by the flippant wrist of a cross-eyed hipster. On the worst days, the grimaces of regret come in the morning, but most often they come as I lay awake at night, a sudden remembrance of shame amidst the irreconcilable sin of what shouldn't have been, the strenuous pains, the subtle stroke of agony, and a self-conscious pull towards the reinterpretation of guilt. Usually I just roll over and half mutter something like, "What are you thinking? Stop it. I will kill you." On the worst days, these thoughts are accompanied by the vague feeling that my life will be nothing more than an accumulation of these regrets until they overcome me. The worst regret is the image of my childhood friend's head split open by a rocky clump of dirt. See, we'd been playing in the mud, the foundations for new buildings out in the subdivision behind my house, and I had found a bit of concrete in the dirt. I threw it, knowing that it would hurt him, that we'd stop and we'd all go home. I wanted to end the war, and I threw it, and it did hurt. I killed him. I thought I did. I remember his blood and the thin piece of scalp covered in hair that you could ply up and the flesh underneath. It's regrets like these that I cannot shake. Oh well, boys will be boys. But must they always? The miracles of 21st century science teach us 3 things in order to prepare us for the uncertain future that lies ahead. The rules of nature are more malleable than we could previously have believed. Taking a cue from nature is never a bad idea. Look to the past before determining the future. A brief history of the 20th century, from a strictly humanitarian perspective, would skip the world wars and focus on the Holocausts instead. Never before were we so systematic and efficient, rigid and implacable eradicators. And if that is a word, I have used it. East Timor, Cambodia, Armenia, Laos, Vietnam, Auschwitz, Dachau, Shoah, Bosnia. All of these episodes, nightmares, fresh rolling over grimaces in the night, dark ages of humanity, shame, fucking shame, most of them, in their efficiency, in their methods of mechanized death, have their foundation in the mass genocide of a fish. This fish, the simple herring. At the turn of the 19th century, they numbered 18 billion worldwide and were hunted with abandon down to the final 100,000s, in which number they approximately exist today. A solitary, long gestation, indeterminate sexed fish against the world's appetite. In 1880, they were fished at the rate of thousands of tons per day, to the extent that the process of the efficient catch of this docile, in-demand, and abundant fish reached genocidal proportions by 1900. Entire industries sprang up in the effort to profit from their eradication. New methods of processing their fatty meat were devised. They invented novel ways and then more efficient ways of harvesting the cadavers. For instance, the first processed and frozen food was an attempt to preserve the freshest form of the overrun from the herring boom. The herring were no good dead for long, this as a consequence of a strange post-mortem glow. At one point in time, eager inventors surmised that the dead herring, who gave off an eerie, faint rainbow luminescence shortly after death, might be fashioned, in some way, mostly by chains, into providing new ways of lighting the dark city streets at night. Herring even competed for a time against gas and electric bills as a herring bell. While herring bells quickly disappeared from most cities in favor of the more dangerous electric lamps, mostly due to several political pushes and pulls by Thomas Edison, many communities, especially in the northeast of the United States, still proudly display their herring bells. Imagine the city streets lit by herring. Inventors imagined that the supply of fish would just go on endlessly. The herring, by nature, are an existential fish, spawning late in their life and assuming a variety of sexual forms at the time of their maturity. After that time has not been studied to my knowledge. There exists a herring fish that for a time inhabits the guise of a sneaker male, whose shape and demeanor is that of a female. There is a reason for this. After herring have mated, it is the male who tends to the eggs, upon which a female might add more real estate, so to speak, once she has been allowed to search for food. The female is not particular about which male fertilizes her eggs. However, after they hatch, the most potent male and the female will defend their territory against all other fish, including other herring. The sneaker male's job, then, is to imitate the scent and movements of the female fish in just such a way as to fool the guarding male. This often involves an elaborate dance and all manner of chemical exchanges. Once accepted as the female, the sneaker fish will then proceed to fertilize all of the eggs, as her gonad is twice the size of the male fish, and she is capable of fertilizing almost 3 times as many eggs. We look for these signs of life imitating art, idiosyncrasies of a sign predicting our fate or precipitating it. What we often see is nature's total disregard for the categorical logic which we have imposed upon it. It is a fascinating maneuver of free will, rivaled only in the human species by the ability to communicate our own death. Some have done so years ahead of timeliness, and if that is a word, I have used it. Celebrities, figureheads, singer-songwriters, artists, innovators, messiahs, salesmen, crooners, politicians. Beyond all the horror, the playgrounds, and the mud fights, we all have a role to play. The horror of assuming these roles within a technological society like ours is the extent to which human nature is routinely exploited, the extent to which our humanity is vivisected and sacrificed as little more than a means to an end.
You're an errand boy, sent by grocery clerks to collect a bill.
Christ, Pontius Pilate, Lazarus, a writer with a beard, a poet with a beard, a poet without a beard. Do I dare disturb the universe? What I want to do, more than simply explaining your torment, is to simply toss all the elements of your story into the air and see the configuration of their movement. Where are we then, you and I? The critics seemed unsure whether your books were burned in an alley or a dumpster. Of course, none of them bothered fact-checking a single detail. Is this footage a journey into a dangerous space, a back entrance to the mind, an access port to a public domain of private relics?
Behold the truth that abides in us. Reveal that truth unto that maker.
I reveal my inmost self unto my God.
Unto my God.
You once asked me if I thought people's normal state of being was confusion. I told you I thought we all go about our business in the exact same way, that people are usually very sure of themselves. We like it this way, and in a way, comfortable ignorance is a measure of coherent mythology. All of this is working out fine for us. If people were actually honest with themselves, we might feel lost, alone amidst a sea of unsure signs and symbols, dashed against the rocks of insignificance. It's really this nice, socially comforting veil of conformity and deceit that's binding us all together. We internalize these lies and they become us. We assume different roles in society based on our belief that they are reflections of our purpose in life. Is it any wonder that we don't know who we are? but we're pretty sure Michael Keaton is a legitimate actor, and this man is a total smarmbucket? Oh, we know deep down it's all a ruse, some hideously clever and diabolical contraption, don't we? Perhaps what you saw briefly, and this is what I believe prompted the question, was a world free of the comfortable ignorance. It's painful, isn't it? I have come back to tell you all. The world I have seen cannot be shared or communicated. In your case, it was comfortable to believe the simplest story, rather than to decipher the painful truth yours has to tell. Maybe I'm wrong, and that's not a story I can tell either. You have the right to argue with me. You have the right to say that is not what you meant at all. You have the right to cry. You have the right to correct me if I'm wrong. But what you cannot change is the story I'm about to tell. Together we went to the Baha'i temple, where I told you they worshipped fire. This was untrue. This was a place of meditation and prayer for all, they told us. Their core belief is that all religions share a unified vision, a single story of an almighty, all-knowing God. They believe that the world's prophets, from all religions, have come to humanity holding up a hand, and that each of their messages were as fingers leading to a common truth. It is and it isn't. I have moved through the dusty back alleys of Beijing, the cobbled streets of Pinyao, the Muslim markets of Delhi, the metropolitan streets of Mumbai. I have stood on the beach in Barcelona, seen Gaudi, and been amazed. I have heard humanity telling itself so many versions of the same story. But the God the stories told of was never the same. It was not unique either. It was not always even God. It was the cross-legged sleeping sailor, the hungry gypsy mother, the speck of spit in the dancing beard of a charlatan, the banal advertisement that turned no one on that day or the next, and finally, now, the story that turns on itself. Finally, only banality interests me. For me, the image of happiness was two women eating apples in a field in the south of China. That last sentiment is borrowed from another, but it marks the distinction between creator and imitator in this story. I'm telling this craziness I'm selling, the ability to follow obsessions that lead nowhere, the desire to create or imitate, curate or destroy that is entangled with our material being, our mortality, our morality, that looks upon itself and turning homeward, decides to take another path and continues to wander, second star to the left and straight on, pointlessly, but with great intent and personal conviction. I told you they worshipped fire, but I was wrong. They worshipped a way of thinking that excused itself with grace. We made fun of it for the afternoon by believing in it, by embracing its assuredness, and then we went back to being broken. We gave it a chance. We tried to see it in the full reflection of time, but nothing would show. Our looking glass had already been cast aside. In your Kickstarter letter, you spoke of patronage without production, of finding a place where you might be able to create without financial burdens, without the comfortable ignorance of modernity. As I flew back to China, I hoped you might find that place. Now, as I piece together this video letter, I more clearly see your story for what it is, a dream devoutly to be wished. Dear John, you are the change in your life. Do not hesitate.
Do not hesitate.
Do not
Do
waste
not waste
away.
away.
Create against all odds, against all obstructions. Continue creating. There's a calm truth that follows you. You feel things deeply, and things affect you greatly. This is the sign of an authentic human experience. I envy you. In Chicago, I filmed you putting up one of the black dots which have followed you around the country while in exile. As I now watch the final shot, I wonder if anyone would notice it, or if it will just be a single, small, black stain, a symbol without significance in a city crying out for meaning. The wish to give that image meaning is not the only reason for this letter. It was really just to get some things off my chest, to run down some of the ideas that first popped into my mind when Chris explained your situation. Is this letter about belief or delusion? Life or rebirth? I wasn't able to keep all of it together, was I? Chris eating meat, misunderstanding things, allowing life to imitate art, suspending disbelief, confessing my own personal nightmares and dark grimaces of regret, the inexorable progress of time, the spectral sex of herring, genocide, scientific dead ends, taking life into one's own hands, reflections in a mirror, obsessions leading nowhere. You are the connection, John. And so this letter is for me, a personal affirmation of our friendship, an encounter with something wholly other, which is dealt with poorly, leaving a hollow pang of regret, which is then understood with almost incomprehensible clarity upon learning some new bit of information, which leads to reinterpreting the story as one of redemption, and finally, the faithful seeds of hope for a better future, free of misinterpretations and free of regret. Always yours. Love, Brandon.